Good afternoon and welcome back to our Network Future for our afternoon session with our panel on building a global coalition for secure digital infrastructure. We've got a fantastic panel lined up for you. We have Oriel Petri, Director, Technology and Advanced Manufacturing from the Department for International Trade. We have Mike Lawton, Manager, International Public Policy from Access Partnership. And we have Sarabjit Singh, Global Sales Director from Keysight. Now, as with this morning's panels, we want to make this as interactive as possible, so please do ask questions through the platform. And if you weren't with us this morning, I better introduce myself. I'm Matthew Evans, Director of Markets here at Tech UK. Now, throughout today, we've heard about the UK policy context and the technology that's sweeping and revolutionising the industry as a whole. This session aims to look at this from a global perspective. And I think it's worth saying, in responding to the Diversification Task Force's report earlier this year, the government committed to strengthening UK capability and establishing the UK as a key player in the global supply chain. And establishing, or indeed re-establishing, depending on your viewpoint, the UK as a key player could be a range of complementary and somewhat interdependent outcomes. It could mean the UK playing a greater role in setting international standards. It could mean positioning the UK as a fantastic place and destination to both conduct R&D into more open, disaggregated networks, as well as being an early adopter of that type of technology. And it can also mean building greater UK capacity and capability to take a greater slice of a portion of those networks on a global scale, particularly given some of our strengths in software, AI, and neutral host networks that we heard about this morning. So hopefully during this panel, and indeed for the rest of this conference, you'll have a greater understanding of what that government ambition means and how we can bring that to life. To put this in a bit of context, the UK currently accounts for approximately 2% of telecom suppliers' global mobile revenues. And the government, I think, is cognizant that will not drive significant change in the market independently. So there's obviously some questions that we need to ask then. How can the UK build global consensus on the pressing issue of telecom supply chain diversification? What's our value proposition as a market in which to trade, invest and innovate? The final session will hopefully shine a bit of light onto this. Now, as I said, we've got a great lineup of panelists, so that is enough for me. And I'm going to ask our panelists in order of Mike, Sarab and Oriel to introduce themselves a little bit and give their view on what the UK looks like as a telecom market from a global perspective and how we can live up to that ambition. So Mike, to get us started, over to you.
Well, first, I'd just like to say thanks for organising the panel, Matthew. I'm grateful to be asked to sort of speak. So why should you listen to me? I'm Mike Lawton. As Matt said, I'm a Senior Model Policy Manager for UK and Europe in Access Partnership. I lead a lot of our UK-focused work around this issue, around telecoms, around supply chains, and indeed around we also focus on tech and other telecom regulatory issues. Access Partnership has been around since around 1999, and the germination of that has very much been centered on tech, telecom and space policy as the sector has grown. So to agree with our clients. And through those sort of 20 plus years, we built a team of policy experts, such as I purport to be on this panel, regulatory experts and engineers across 7 or 8 different offices now in London, Brussels, North America, Middle East, Africa and Asia. So I hope to bring some of those perspectives as well, apart from my own sort of relatively narrow Europe focus, this panel. But in recent years, been very proud to say that we're supporting both telecom vendors and groups of companies looking to challenge the ecosystem as it stands in the last couple of years around this, and I've been very pleased to be engaging with folks in DIT and in DCMS on that as well. You also asked just for me to speak briefly about the role of the UK as a telecoms market. So I'll just say this: I think we're all aware that it's just 2%, but I think there are markets a bit smaller than that have a much greater outsized impact on the telecom supply chain. So I think there's certainly a great deal of potential combining some of the UK's natural assets, the great deal of policy momentum in the market around this particular issue, as well as some of the targeted interventions that are being contemplated for the UK to re-establish that capability. It was not so long ago, although it was not so long ago the UK did have those types of suppliers, so I'm fairly optimistic about it.
Great, thanks, Mike. Sarab, coming over to you, and interested in from that global perspective as well, in terms of how Keysight views the UK.
Right. Thank you very much, Matthew. It's great to be with you and other participants in this virtual panel discussion. As far as I'm concerned, I lead a global business of Keysight for 5G NES plus operator and service provider segment. Previously of Keysight, basically it was founded in 1939 as Hewlett-Packard, HP, spun off in 99 as Agilent when HP decided to go into PC laptop business, and then it became Keysight in 2014. Keysight has a very rich history of many inventions and enabling innovation. In fact, HP was the first company who saw the seeds of Silicon Valley in the US. Our businesses is split into 3 segments: commercial communications, aerospace, defense, government, and the third is the electronic industrial market. In my vertical segment, I'm personally tracking 3 big themes within the industry. First one is transition to 5G. The second one is clearly there's a big effort around open networks, interoperability, and open RAN. And the third is transition to virtualization, transition to cloud native. As far as 5G is concerned, we as Keysight started this way back in 2015, 2016, and engaged actually even before 3GPP came up with the 5G specifications. And this is with the Verizon networks in US, where they created the first pre-5G standard 5G TF. 4 companies took part in that first 5G TF call in the world, and Keysight was one of them. So we have enabled numerous 5G industry first along the way. In the process, we have built industry-leading 5G platforms, enabling our customer success within the whole ecosystem, whether it's a components, chipset, mobile phones, devices, NAMs, and network operators. As far as Open RAN is concerned, Keysight leads and contributes significantly into advancements of Open RAN in both standardizations and ecosystem. We have been active member of ORAN Alliance since its inception in 2018, and we are also members of Telecoms Infra Project TIP. We lead and contribute in almost all the major ORAN Alliance technical specifications for open interfaces, cloud, transport, security, etc. Coming to the question of I agree with Mike in his opening comments about the UK looks like as a telecom market. Of course, 5G is at the cusp, and we, from the market perspective, operators, all 4 major operators in UK, Telefonica, EE, Three, or Vodafone have launched their 5G services. Vodafone is one of the founding members for Open RAN and Alliance, so they have, and also the TIP. Vodafone and BT both are the contributing members for the TIP project. So as an industry and as a main contributors to that industry, the companies are looking for the UK contribution into the global perspective. And of course, UK has been a very important destination for companies to come along and work from here.
Sarah, thanks for that great insight from you in terms of that view of the UK market. Oriel, same question over to you, but I guess sort of looking at this both from an FDI perspective as well as obviously a potential export opportunity perspective as well.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thanks for setting me up so beautifully, Mike and Sarah. That's really fantastic to have that kind of intro. So my name is Oriel Petrie, and I am the Director for Technology and Advanced Manufacturing at the Department for International Trade. So I am a civil servant. I advise ministers in the Department for International Trade. And just so that everybody understands, there's 3 main things that the Department for International Trade does. And I know we're talking international here. On the one hand, we negotiate free trade agreements. And the importance actually in free trade agreements to telecoms is not to be underestimated. The second thing we do is that we have a finance arm that's called UK Export Finance, and it's there to kind of make sure that no business fails to export for lack of funding. And the third bit the department does, and that's the bit that I work in, is that we support exports from British companies and investment from across the globe to make the UK competitive. And Matthew, thank you for a really broad opening question. I mean, I think you've heard this morning from the Minister who sits in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. So they set the policy, and my department is there really to kind of adopt that policy. And to look at how we, as I say, bring in trade and investment, but also how we think about it internationally. And I think Mike and you set the scene quite well. Yes, we're not a huge market, maybe only 2%, but actually the role that the UK government can play here in that space for diversification, which clearly is not a national thing, it's an international challenge, is substantial. And, being for the first time in charge of our own trade negotiations gives us a great opportunity to kind of look at this. So I think there's a number of ways in which the British government is trying to corral a sort of general pan-global sort of approach, both bilaterally and multilaterally. So for those of you who kind of watched it very closely, you may have seen that when we held the G7 presidency, we kind of really focused on a global conversation on diversification. You may have seen that in quite a lot of the trade negotiations that we're doing, particularly with Australia and New Zealand at the moment, but also in our discussions with Singapore, for instance, on the digital economy agreement, telecoms and data and digital are really at the heart of what this government is trying to achieve. And then just to pick up on one of the other things that you mentioned and that the other panelists mentioned, this question of R&D and innovation clearly is critical. So this is a bit like automotive is at a moment where we're really, the market, the industry and the sectors are pivoting, and the government therefore is really kind of interested in kind of saying how can it kind of encourage the UK being this hotbed for innovation for R&D. Of course, the challenge for government is always to balance that attractiveness with value for money, and that's always a little bit the tension between a department like the Department for Culture, Media and Sport and the Treasury that has to kind of balance the books. But I think you've seen, and I'm sure the Minister this morning talked about it, and we can perhaps go into this a bit later, the government is trying to roll out a whole number of programmes. They're looking not just at the rollout for 5G, but also much longer term to Open RAN and to kind of 6G. And where my department comes in with its people across the globe in posts from Tokyo to Seoul to San Francisco and everywhere in between, is to kind of think about how can we foster that environment and how can we encourage big businesses to come to the UK, but also the smaller disruptors. How can we bring them in? How can we get them to come here to do their early stage R&D? And there's a huge amount of work that cross government, working as one government, taking a systems approach we're trying to achieve here.
Fantastic. Thanks, Oriel. And I'm going to come back to a couple of things that you have talked about there, but we'll move on a little bit. I think it was interesting, this morning, Catherine, UK MD, CEO rather, for Ericsson, talked about the importance of international standards in telecoms. And we've known that sort of the standards bodies hold an incredible amount of power, but ultimately have been able to drive economies of scale and other benefits on a global scale. And I guess, and Mike, I don't want to come to you unexpectedly, so I'm going to tee you up a little bit before I ask this question. But what does that sort of enhanced role in international standards bodies look like, do you think? And the supplementary question to that is, do we have that skills base in place at the moment, that experience of being in these standard bodies, that knowledge of the telco sector? Do we have the actual people who are used to doing this and are effective in that realm available to us? Or is this a far larger sort of, path that we need to be on to play a role in those bodies, but it's going to be aspirational in the short term? I appreciate that's a big question, Mike, but you can get stuck in, and we can come to Oriel and Sarah as well.
Good few parts there, Matthew. Thanks for that. So I think on the question of the importance of international standards, I think the opportunity for the UK there, it is clear. I think stepping up that engagement in those bodies is not this exercise in dealing with the dry, dusty tomes of various ITU 3GPP documents, although they excite the people on this call very much, I'm sure. It's really about being able to ensure that as you become this hotbed of R&D, what you're actually researching and developing becomes globally relevant, and you can use that as a base to export, and you reach those economies of scale, as Matthew put it more succinctly than I did. Unfortunately, I think what we've seen from certain advice that the government has received from telecom supply chain board is almost to adopt quite an approach of a bit of retreat and concede that we won't get very much out of those forums, and instead we should adopt a kind of UK profile of things and try and do our slight own, try and go off into our own rabbit hole of standards in an effort to simplify it. And I think that's really, it's understandable. I think there is a bit of a mountain to climb for the UK government to re-establish itself in those forums. But I think the way to go about that is to throw yourselves in rather than try to draw up a bit of a drawbridge and simplify things, if I can speak to that. Did I cover all of your questions, Matthew? Yeah.
Desperately trying to come off mute before speaking. I think the other thing, Mike, was just that sort of that skills base. Clearly there were times where the UK was really active in these standards bodies. I think by definition, if we're talking about trying to exert a greater influence than we currently do, as a recognition that we've stood back for a variety of reasons. And I guess sort of, do we have that skills base today that we can go and do that, or is it something that we're going to need to grow into?
I think it's going to be something we need to grow into. There's going to have to be a lot more liaison between sort of various industry bodies, especially as they change. There's 3GPP, Telecom Infra Project, and Iran Alliance, and I think I understand that the government is starting to reach out to understand how they quite cooperate in those bodies, but that needs to be formalised and sort of built up appropriately over time. I don't think it's going to be something we do tomorrow. But also in bodies like the ITU, where although the UK is very good at securing certain high offices, the sort of pipeline behind that and the sort of exercise in those bodies has somewhat waned over the years.
Great. Oriel, I'm going to come to you next, and then we'll come to Sarah, maybe for that sort of more international looking in at the UK perspective as well.
On the same question?
Yes. Yeah.
So I think, I wouldn't disagree with Mike, and I don't think across Whitehall we disagree. I suppose the point I would make, and there's definitely a recognition that we need to do more in terms of standards. And again, the Minister may have touched on it this morning. This is very much something that Nadine Dorries and her ministerial team is looking at quite closely. I suppose the point I would make is that it's not just necessary for the UK to kind of up its influence. I suppose the reflection that we've got is that a number of these standards bodies have been influenced by forces that might be a bit different to the way in which we see the world, and that there is a need for us to kind of come together as an alliance to kind of go into these standards bodies and say, this is how we see we can balance the kind of the difficult balances that democracies need to make to kind of get it right. So I think, yes, I think there is definitely a desire for the UK as a nation to get more closely involved. But I think there's also a real desire from across the government and through our network of ambassadors across the globe to kind of do this in a concerted effort and I guess that's kind of where the G7 kind of thinking was coming from, and some of the things that we're pursuing with the G20, but also some of the work that we're trying to kind of do in terms of broader reform of the WTO. So that I think the government is looking at sort of alliances across a number of multilateral fora, and is also looking at how it can kind of work together with on a bilateral basis with countries that might have the same objectives as the British government does. And on skills, this is quite tough, right? So I don't think it's a secret to tell you that people like me who know Whitehall really well are probably not experts on Open RAN and are probably not experts on networks. I have a chief scientific advisor, Dr. Mike Short, who thankfully is, and he gives me much cover. But I think, that's another challenge that governments and regulators have, is to kind of really keep abreast of how fast stuff is developing and the technical challenges here. That's even before you get into emerging technologies such as quantum, that obviously is also going to play a role in the future.
Great, thanks, Oriel. Sarah, just want to come to you on that sort of standard point, and I guess sort of the importance, or another view on sort of the UK continuing to influence global standards, but also making sure that we're aligned to them in a way to make it presumably easier to invest and trade with the UK in telco area.
Sure. As far as standard bodies are concerned, these are mainly led by industry itself rather than government directly. But there are so many UK companies who are actually actively participating and creating and taking this forward, whether it's the 3GPP, ETSI, or Open RAN Alliance and TIP. I mentioned about the Vodafone and BT, but there are so many companies and even the university which is adding and helping to take this forward. As far as government is concerned, I think one of the initiatives that UK government has taken is basically to kickstart the process of diversification and build momentum. Well, I would say the UK government are making the early progress in establish smart RAN, open network interoperability center like Sonic Labs, right? That will create a platform for existing emerging suppliers to come together to test and demonstrate interoperable solutions. As far as skills, I agree with Mike, it cannot be developed overnight. But at the same time, I must acknowledge that, for example, AI will be going to be bedrock of all innovations going forward. And I think UK is today among the top 5 countries in the world for AI research. So as far as skills are concerned, participation from the companies in the standardization process, I think is none to nobody else. And as far as UK government's initiative and Oriel has mentioned about the G7 one, I would have come later, and the creation of this Sonic Lab, which is comparable to what we call as OTIC labs for ORAN Alliance, similar concept, but the UK government has taken an initiative so that all participants can come together and participate in that is a great initiative from the UK government, I would say.
Fantastic, thanks, Sarab. I guess just picking up on that, Sarab, and I'm going to come back to you if you don't mind on that. Oriel talked about sort of an alliance of sort of like-minded democracies, countries on the standards point. I guess sort of one of the benefits of more open, more disaggregated networks is that the clear benefit is you don't need to invest and produce a product that hits the entire stack. You can find a slice of that, specialize in it, and you still have access to a very significant global market. Sarah, you sort of mentioned AI there. Where do you think sort of some of the UK's strengths are? And when you look at the UK as a sort of possibly an area of innovation in telecoms, where do you think sort of the traditional strengths for the UK lie? And sort of and the follow-up question is sort of how can we best utilize those really?
Yeah, sure. So like I was saying, the contribution in the 3GPP and ORAN Alliance is been magnificent from the UK companies. And I also mentioned the skill set about the AI going forward. You talk about the slice of you don't need to build a whole stack. So I should also mention a second initiative from UK government, which I frankly like very much, is called FRANC, the Future RAN Competition, and has been launched by DCMS to fund innovative R&D projects to help new wireless communication technology. The initiative will award funding of tech and telecoms innovators to accelerate and development deployment for viable, I would say, open RAN products for the UK public 5G and for the world. I mean, the goal is to encourage new equipments to enter the UK telecom supply chain, right, and create a stronger case for the government and business investment in new mobile technology. At the end of the day, the technology is global, and like Oriel was saying, the government is working with many other governments. She mentioned Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, but I would also mention US, all the Five Eyes countries, or G7, and maybe expanded to G20, like Oriel was saying. So many other countries, even India, has initiated the similar sort of process where they want to bring the Open RAN diversified network into there. So there are many like-minded countries. I think that together we can take it to the next level.
Brilliant, thanks for that. Mike, just come to you on that sort of question on the areas of expertise.
So I'd like to just agree largely with what Sarah said. I'd add some countries to that list, Malaysia, Mexico. I mean, it's now difficult to sort of flip over an atlas without seeing some wonderful, wonderful disaggregation initiative. And I think as far as possible, well, to a large extent, those are being driven by certainly European MNOs and a lot of them, as Sarah pointed out, driven by Vodafone, BT and other British UK-led contributors to kind of things like Telecom Infra Project. If we come back to the sort of original question about what are the sort of skills base, again, very difficult to dissent, really. There's a huge, I mean, all the people in this room and preaching to the choir here, but there's a great tech base here on which we can build. The point is that, we don't need to sort of build another huge full-scale vendor. We really should find a niche where, and maybe it's security, maybe it's around energy efficiency, or some of the other areas in the frank competition call, and maybe that's where we sort of start to germinate the seed of those emerging vendors. But I would say it doesn't need to. I think we would spend a lot of time and energy trying to replicate a full stack vendor along the lines of the established few, and we might not necessarily get as far as we'd like, even in partnership with some of our allies in the groups, such as the government often evokes the sort of D10 as the main partners in this. So I think it's about bringing those assets to bear in the right way. And the other way that I think the UK has a great advantage is it has an opportunity to sort of lead by example in its regulatory approach to things, in its openness to cooperate with other countries. I think Frank, could easily be multiplied in concert with other countries. The US has sort of mooted a multilateral telecom security fund. There are initiatives in Horizon Europe and in even in the France COVID recovery strategy around this issue of telecom diversification. And I think it would really it would play very much to our real strengths rather than perhaps mine to come up with a way to bring those funds together in a sort of truly cooperative way. I think right now people are still approaching this as a nation by nation approach. Ultimately, we see that although these sort of pots of money are available, there's still quite a high risk appetite associated with a lot of particularly UK R&D funding, and there's still a lot of geographical restrictions about where a lot of that activity can take place, even if it sometimes inhibits the broader goal of attracting people to come in the first place.
Great, thanks very much for that, Mike. Oriel, I'm going to come to you, but I'm just going to sort of phrase it a little bit differently, if you don't mind. And this might seem like a bit of a segue for those people who haven't looked at it, but the Integrated Defence Review, sort of, technology superpower was the sort of catchphrase for us, and and I paraphrase you, I can't quite remember what it sort of said, but it said there was sort of three categories for technology that the UK would approach, which is a leader, sort of a supporter or contributor, and then a great adopter. I guess, and you don't need to sort of take it technology by technology, but has the UK government applied that to this area? And I guess for you, what are the most exciting segments when it comes to that export potential, I guess? What type of technologies sort of spring to mind there, or come across your desk most frequently?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think the integrated review that you're referring to, I think, is a really interesting document for lots of different reasons, because it's a very thoughtful document, and it's a document that sort of looks at technology in that international context, and it's very thought-provoking as a result. Yes, the government is looking at technologies through that lens, and I think it's actually quite a useful lens, because it does. It fosters a proper conversation about how and where you want to, as you say, kind of own or lead the technology, and where you think actually you need to kind of collaborate. I'd say it's not that long ago that framework was published, and I think we are working across Whitehall through how exactly we apply it. Telecoms is clearly key to this. Other technologies, underpinning technologies like AI, I mentioned, quantum. We haven't mentioned photonics, but I think that's another area where the UK is really rather good. I think our sense is that, as you said, Mike, there is real quality in the R&D across the kind of spectrum, and programs that you've referred to are there really to kind of bring in Open RAN and kind of longer term sort of innovation. I suppose for the government, the challenge is how do you foster the commercialisation of those early stage innovation and R&D breakthroughs, if you like, and we are really trying to kind of do this as well as we can, only to come in when we need to and not to when we don't. But clearly in something like, I'm probably most familiar when it comes to kind of quantum computing, where there's been quite a lot of work that we've been doing across Whitehall. That's at a relatively early stage. It's also quite a sensitive technology, let's put it this way, and it's one where we're going to have to really think carefully how we collaborate to kind of keep sort of international competitiveness. So these are quite difficult balancing acts. I guess that's why you're asking me the question, and I'm sorry I can't give you a perfect answer to exactly how government is doing that, but it's the key to it, I think, and perhaps I haven't emphasized this enough, it's the kind of nexus between the innovation and the innovation bodies, so UKRI, but also the research councils. And then it's also the interface with industry, which perhaps I haven't sort of emphasised enough. And I think the report that you referred to that was chaired by Ian Livingston is such a critical partnership in these things that are really quite tricky, quite sort of, some of it emerging, as we say. We don't know exactly what the applications are going to be. So that sort of whole kind of collaboration is absolutely critical here. In terms of exports, AI is obviously quite a long way down the road. Cyber is something where we do a huge amount of exports, and I think we're seen as a really strong international player in cybersecurity. Sort of robotics is also something where we see sort of a lot of exports. I suppose in pure telecoms and in terms of the telecoms innovation, it almost feels like there's kind of some innovation that we need to drive, and that's what all these domestic initiatives are kind of focused at. And then the government's challenge is then, as that commercialisation happens, is then to support those businesses to kind of find international buyers and to grow internationally. Because as we've said now repeatedly, clearly the UK market isn't big enough for these companies to really scale and really have an influence. So that is quite a multi-dimensional kind of challenge, but one that is deeply satisfying, and one actually, where we are really trying to kind of bridge all those different bits to kind of do what we can to kind of foster and make the innovation sizzle.
Fantastic. I think we can quote you on making the innovation sizzle, Oriel, after this. Look, I think one for Sarah and Mike, maybe, and I won't ask Oriel if government comes up with the name of Sonic or Frank first and then works backwards, because Sonic just quite a cool name if you're of a certain age, I guess. So, but I'm going to resist that one because I have asked it before, I think. But I guess where are the opportunities, Mike and Sarah, to really sort of drive that private sector innovation, but sort of spurred and partially sort of helped on its way by government and regulatory support. And I think sort of the Sonic work is really interesting because you've got the Catapult, you've got DCMS, you've got Ofcom, who are looking at it from those different perspectives of, are there regulatory barriers to adoption here in the UK? So can you create a home market? You've got DCMS from sort of a policy perspective, and you've got that Catapult, which is obviously a great interface between the private sector and the test bed. So I guess sort of, where are the opportunities? Where can we go stronger? What's a good start? in terms of helping spur this innovation. And Sarah, I don't know if you want to go first on that.
I can take. So I've divided my answer into multiple segments. So first of all, I would say that there is a great tradition of early innovation and research. For example, I always quote like the World Wide Web, right? Innovated by Tim Lee from UK, but the biggest internet companies you don't see from the UK, right? Although the innovation had her here. Now we are at the same cusp where we are doing this diversified open land innovation and AI, cybersecurity. Now is the time for some help from which government is providing and boosting to create unicorns from UK itself, right? One of the future big unicorn companies coming out of UK. Rather than only importing. So that's one point I would say. And I would say Sonic and Frank, I personally consider is one of the initiatives. Coming to Open Alliance, and probably there's a question in the window I can see about, and I can probably handle both. So if you look at ORAN Alliance, there are about 300 plus members of ORAN Alliance. Out of those, only 30 are mobile network operators. So you say most of them are either system integrators or vendors, right? And if you see the today telecoms market, it is only a handful of companies who are major vendors, but now it is opening up. So that is the scope for the smaller companies to become bigger giants of tomorrow. Coming to the question, which I can see is how valuable I think UK universities and academic research, it's paramount. I can say being a member of ORAN Alliance, basically the two universities, King's College of London and Bristol University are already members of ORAN Alliance, and they're contributing to the standardization. So the research we're going in UK governments is also of paramount importance. So these two, I would say, is creating the unicorns for tomorrow, and there's a greater opportunities for smaller companies to get into, and some boost, help and aid from the government. They can truly become the unicorns from tomorrow. I truly believe in that.
Well, panelists, you are giving me lots of quotes for Twitter, I'm sure. So Frank and Sonic creating the unicorns of tomorrow, I think, is another one. Mike, there's no pressure on this one, but it's sort of 2 out of 3 at the moment. But I'm gonna pass that sort of very unenviable task over to you, Mike, in terms of where do you think sort of the UK could be doing more to spur some of this innovation?
Well, I'll do my best to come up with sort of bon mot that the others have managed. I really feel like I missed the meeting where we all decided on catchphrase was going to be, guys. I'm sorry. Look, I think the UK needs to do a couple of things. I know it's easy for me to sort of sit here and suggest that there's oodles of money that hasn't been hitherto found before, and government has a huge challenge, bigger than any in a generation, to kind of balance the books right now. I really appreciate that, but I see that other countries are in a similar situation, have managed to find a good deal more. I think the UK came out with a fantastic early move with the 250 million dedicated solely to sort of telecom supply chain issues. But I think the speed at which it started to give out some of that money through Frank and other things has also been really laudable. Unfortunately, we are starting to see things like in France that number's been trebled. We are seeing, in other comparable economies, there's funding in Germany around the sort of €1 billion sort of magnitude. I haven't got the exact figure in front of me. And in even smaller economies, there are sort of quite mature initiatives. I'll come back to Indonesia. There are sort of mature initiatives where there's a great partnership between industry, government, and academia that are sort of dedicating their entire focus towards influencing sort of the national standards development. So what more can the UK do? Well, one is, we heard the 250 million being described as an initial investment, and I think the comprehensive spending review industry would very much welcome if some more came out, so we could sort of keep up with the Joneses almost. But otherwise, I think I'd agree with Sarah. We need a sort of conveyor belt approach when it comes down to the sort of nuts and bolts telecom innovation around photonics. I think the UK's already got a fantastic cluster over in Northern Ireland that's sort of being funded to try and generate that potential. there's many tales, as Sarah's already alluded to, of these fantastic innovations that then get sort of re-exported back to us, be it the World Wide Web or graphene or anything like that. So I think there needs to be there's great sort of early seed funding. The challenge is always the next stage, and I think that's where things like Frank come in, and the DCMS team done a fantastic job of sort of putting that together, and sort of bringing in companies around it. But I still think there's just a bit too much risk aversion that some of it might go wrong. But really, when you get into things like Open RAN, you're sort of on the cusp of really sort of TRL 9, that very high level of technological maturity. So I think there needs to be a bit more directed towards things that are near term but ready, with a bit more risk appetite, because things might go wrong, but that's how you innovate. And then sort of beyond that, applying that same spirit in which we've generated all these wonderful tech unicorns to those telecom companies as well. Not sure I've helped you with the clickbait there, Matt, but
you know what, I'm going to paraphrase you with a conveyor belt of innovation, Mike, and say that you've done the job very well.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your spinning me.
You've also teed up a question which I suspect Oriel knows is coming, and I suspect she's not going to be able to say much on this, but I'm going to ask it in case, because you never know. We're friends here, Oriel. It's a private room. No, it's not. But, you know, £250 million, I think Chancellor did describe it as an initial investment into this area. Comprehensive spending reviews coming up. Anything you can, lift the lid on and let us know amongst the friendly gathering that we've got.
I mean, I love you trying. And did you read the press last week where a Secretary of State fell into this trap and the trouble that they got into? So I can neither say anything nor do I know about anything. I would say so. I think Mike, your points are really thoughtful and well made. And as I alluded to before, one of the things that is really interesting about being a civil servant is that you are you're looking at a balance all the time of where to spend taxpayers' money, and unfortunately there are considerable demands on it. And yes, I agree. I think across Whitehall we also quote the figures that you quoted. I think what's quite interesting, and I suppose time will tell, and you may think I'm being naive here, but there is always just a slightly different approach in the UK. And it is a bit more private sector led, and it is a bit more innovation driven. And I suppose I think there's quite a strong sort of philosophy that goes back decades, from the Treasury, that a lot of this should be driven not just by public money, but it needs to be driven by quite a dynamic combination that you, I think, also referred to, Mike. So, I think it will be interesting to see how it plays out. But I think I suppose what I'm saying is they are, from a philosophical point of view, slightly different approaches. And I suppose what I can see is I don't see this government fundamentally changing that sort of philosophy. What I do see is a Prime Minister who is really passionate about this science superpower kind of focus. And I do see a government that in my 20 years as a civil servant is kind of coming together across the spectrum of research, startup, scale up, and then growth that you quite rightly identify, Mike, is not an easy path. Where the government does feel that there are certain targeted interventions that it might want to make to kind of be able to scale and to grow and to sort of, as you say, Sarabjit, make sure that, the early investment in early R&D finds its way back into British taxpayers' money, because the companies have then grown and then gone global. And I think the role of a department like international trade is key there, because clearly to go global, you need to go global. You can't just do that in the UK. So I think that's my answer, and I'm sorry it wasn't a two sentence one.
Can I just come back on one point?
Yeah, of course.
I'm sorry you didn't get the scoop that you were hoping for with the comprehensive spending review, by the way. We were all ways of bated breath. I think we agree fundamentally, Oriel, on the sort of balanced need for taxpayers' money, and I think industry agrees it needs to be industry-led. But what I'd say is, in the case of certain of these innovations, particularly around Open RAN, there's such a huge weight of industry momentum behind it. Really, what the challenge for the UK isn't so much will open and disaggregated networks happen or not. It's, where will it happen? And there's a sort of industrial strategy sort of approach, which, has been a bit of a departure from, I think, previous government approaches you've already alluded to. But there's also just there's a pie in the oven, and how big your slice is sort of how much you're willing to put behind it. And I think other countries are putting in substantial bets to buy up some of that pie.
Great, thanks, Mike. I'm not going to press Oriel on that anymore, because I suspect that it's a little bit unfair to do so. But I guess, Oriel, on that point, and I suppose looking at it from that FDI perspective, you mentioned one of the sort of capitals that you mentioned at the beginning was Tokyo, and obviously the UK Japan free trade agreement was quite important. But around that time, we also saw the Secretary of State meeting the CEO of NEC, and then the investment in the Neutral RAN R&D centre here in the UK, and Sarab's done my job for me. He's been answering the audience questions a little bit before I've even asked them, which is brilliant, Sarab. Thank you. But when you look at that sort of UK value proposition, I guess outside of cash, let's sort of leave that to one side for the moment. University, academic research community, I guess starting to see with Vodafone and some of the other operator announcements a sort of domestic demand. So you come here, you invest, we'll buy some of your products as well. When you're out talking to other companies, or indeed when you were talking to NEC, what were sort of the plus points that you were really selling from the UK perspective?
Yeah, thank you. So I think Japan is a really interesting one. I think the free trade agreement that we did there has really focused the government's attention on what more we can do. And I think there's lots of areas where we think the two countries can kind of work together. Some of it sort of straying into the kind of subjects that we're talking about here. So I'd say watch this space. I think there's some really interesting ideas that my colleagues in Post in Tokyo have. And I think there's some really interest in the Department for Business to kind of look at this. I mean, in terms of this kind of research industry piece, I mean, I suppose one of the things that we're talking to particularly quite a number of Japanese big companies about is also coming to do some of their investment, some of their R&D in the UK. And if you look at the Department for Business's innovation strategy, which I think came out in June, there's a very clear line there that's kind of looking at how can we bring foreign investment into our kind of R&D base to do exactly what you're talking about. The things that we find get traction with global corporates, but it'd be really interesting to hear Sarabjit and Mike's views on this as well, and possibly those online as well. The things that we find get real traction is the kind of openness, the collaboration between universities and catapults and centres of excellence and industry. Particularly in a country like Japan, we're seen as doing that perhaps in a slightly different way, and that does really kind of interest big corporates to kind of come here to the UK. So I think it's those sort of more, I guess, slightly more value driven. We've talked a bit about the strengths in the UK. Clearly, they're critical, but I think people like to come to the UK to do R&D because they find it's quite a can-do environment, and where there is a real free flow of ideas between research, innovation, and companies that are looking to solve real day-to-day problems.
Fantastic, thank you, Oriel. Sarah, but I want to come to you on that point in terms of, I suppose if you're looking at sort of your organisation from a global perspective, if you're making the argument to invest in the UK, I guess what would you be selling? But an additional question to what I asked Oriel, what would you what would you like to see the government do to make that case even easier to invest in the UK market?
Yeah, I mean, Oriel mentioned Japan, so I would say it's synergies between the government, because if if I can recall correctly, government of Japan is also bringing the initiative they have called Society 5.0, which is based on 5G open architecture. There's a certification system for 5G deployment based on security and test worthiness, stability and supply and openness. And I think there's a 15% tax incentive the government of Japan is giving. So I think this is a similar model. That's why probably the treaty has worked well. As far as UK is concerned, I think we should not understand we are, as a UK, is open and democratic society. UK can help harness a trusted ecosystem for the open and disaggregated network. Even coming to Keysight as such, I mean, Keysight acquired NI Telecoms, which is basically we are based in Fleet, and there's a major amount of 5G R&D work happens from our organization from the UK itself. So Keysight has invested in the company here and build a strong team of innovators and scientists to build the 5G platform, which worldwide companies are using for launching their 5G products.
Great, thanks, Sarab. Mike, coming over to you in terms of, you've got quite a global perspective. Sort of, what's your view on, the pros and cons of the UK as that investment destination?
I won't rehearse some of the things that Sarab and Petru and Ariel have already gone through, but I think one of the real points of energy in the UK that our client seems to respond to is just the networks that the UK has around the world, and the fact that it is kind of out in front on this particular agenda. It does have this ability to convene a lot of the like-minded markets and start to drive some international consensus and smooth the regulatory path. I'd say on the con side, you did explicitly ask about that. I think some of the policy landscape in the UK around telecom, it seems to cut against the sort of openness and traditional kind of open-mindedness the UK's had about sort of trusted free flow of data around the world. But maybe we might touch on that at a later point or in another more substantive discussion.
I think you might be hinting at some parts of the Telecoms Security Bill there, Mike, which
could well be.
Yeah. Fantastic. We had a couple of questions from the audience. I'm not sure who wants to pick this up, but sort of clearly we've touched on global standards, but what are panelists' thoughts on sort of spectrum band availability and demand in the UK and other major markets? And I guess is that a barrier to, I'm assuming, sort of greater investment or utilization across sort of open and disaggregated networks? And I think sort of spectrum fragmentation has been a challenge cited when it comes to some Open RAN technologies, but not sure who wants to pick that up.
I can try for the first
Great.
one.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, no problem. So basically, UK has around about three areas of the spectrum, which is 700 meg, 3.4 gig, and between 3.6 and 4 gig for the 5G. I think this spectrum, and in 5G world we call as FR1, and I think Ofcom is looking into around 26 gig, which will be FR2 millimeter wave fixed spectrum in the future. I think for needs of the 5G where we are, and although I would say it's a little slow, but still we have like the majority of the country will be covered by 5G by 2027. I think that's the data I've heard. If that is, I think there's plenty of spectrum available for the launch. I mean, even if you see, say for example, from 5G, most of the operators started with FR2 bands, but recently there's a lot of launch in FR1 and the C band, which is around about the same spectrum, which is between the two Wi-Fi bands. So I think the spectrum is there for the launch, and the way the roadmap is and the plan of Ofcom, I think spectrum should not be an issue for this, in my view.
Great, thanks very much, Sarah. Not sure if Mike or Oriel wants to contribute on that one. No, I suspected that spectrum would be Sarab's forte, but okay, where that we're coming to the end of our session, I suppose I want to tee up my colleague Sophie a little bit, and I guess we've got Simon Blagden who's going to give a keynote and do a bit of a fireside chat. Oriel, I'll think of a slightly different way of how to phrase this, but Simon's the chair of the Diversification Advisory Council. What question would you put to him, or what would you really sort of press Simon to advise the government on how we can sort of increase the UK's position in this space? And Mike, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay. But sort of what question or sort of issue would you really push to Simon, or ask Sophie to put to Simon in this space?
Wow, one opportunity. So I really think what we'd be looking for is just a way that we can reconcile all of these different. If you can solve it all in one go, that'd be fantastic. But if you can come up with a way to reconcile this kind of need to ensure kind of UK's own sovereign interests, but at the same time not retreat into away from the kind of multilateral markets where the UK can actually still make a big impact, that would be fantastic. And also, how you can encourage the UK to kind of lead by example. And I will come back to the Telecoms Security Bill. I think some of the language in there around kind of localizing certain infrastructure seems to cut against the grain of the direction in which network technologies are actually going. So how do we make sure that we're not addressing a supply chain problem today to open it up, 10, 15 years down the line when things are, architected very differently than they are today.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Mike. Sarah, same question to you.
So I would say, and not to put Simon on the spot, basically, if I see today, services contribute about 80% to the GDP of UK, and telecom is about 4 or 5%. I would say for Simon to think about making telecom from 5 to 10%, how we can take there and grow this as an industry within the UK. And that will be paramount if we can go from 5% to 10% contribution of telecoms or cybersecurity, AI, quantum making, maybe next 3 to 4, 5 years. That would be brilliant.
Brilliant. So a bit of ambition, and I guess also, you said services, making use of the services strength that we've got in the UK. In terms of how we potentially knit some of this together as well. Oriel, I'm not going to ask the same question for you because I think it'd be a bit harsh for to ask a civil servant to push the advisor to government on this. But I guess challenge us as the sector. What would you like to see a bit more from the audience in a way when it comes to this opportunity? Because I guess that's your role in a way is helping us export, helping us get that inward investment. And I guess how can we come together a bit better to make your life a bit easier and to make the UK that little bit more attractive?
Well, that's a great final question to me. So I think we've covered quite a lot of it here. I think it's about us working really closely together. We have some quite tricky things to balance as the government and as advisors to the government as civil servants. And I think what is most valuable to us is just really open feedback as we've had here, open but also feedback that kind of understands the balance that we're trying to strike here. And I suppose the very practical thing is to support the government in attracting international corporates who we know are going to drive the sort of competitiveness and the innovation in the UK ecosystem, to attract them to come here and to put their innovation and their R&D here. I think that's the really exciting bit of partnership that we can do and lay the path for that future transformation of the sector, and to position the UK at the heart of that international transformation. And just one final thing, I think also to kind of help the government to do that in a way that is collaborative with other countries and with other governments.
Fantastic. Well, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to keep this bang to time, but that is fantastic sort of our discussion with my panelists. So hope you'll all join me in giving them a virtual round of applause for what was a fascinating section, and I've got my 3 sound bites that I wanted out of that as well. So thank you for that, everyone.